In their lust for power, the gods doomed humanity to fight for survival, all for mere sport. However, among the humans, a dark horse will arise. On his journey, he will overcome his limits, gain powers that rival the deities themselves, and ascend to the upper realms to take the fight to them. This is an epic tale of betrayal, revenge, and the birth of a legend.
Snowman had left the hut and ran through the forest while panting heavily. Previously at the hut, the troll had promised to help the man with anything in exchange for the mushroom. Having received the hidden quest with a set time limit, Snowman remembered how side quests usually appeared in the middle of other quests and also greatly affected the flow of events. The side quest titled The Forsaken One was even more special for Snowman because it would allow him to gain a helper. In his case, the helper would assist him with enthusiasm that was equal to the rapport they had built. If memory served him right, the exiled troll, also known as the Forsaken One, was one of the highest-ranking helpers one could find in the entire game. As he raced through the forest, the summoner was motivated, knowing that every second counted, and that the time he invested into the side quest would never go to waste. He was sure of this because he could overturn his hopeless situation if he got the Forsaken One's help with the main quest. The sun gradually began setting as Snowman finally arrived at the edge of a cliff, completely out of breath. The viewers thought it was the end of the road for Snowman because others before him had failed. They thought that the summoner would be no different. He eventually walked to the edge of the cliff and activated his perception skill. Right then, a list of choices appeared: to return empty-handed to the Forsaken One or confirm that he was in the right place using the level 1 botany skill. Instead of choosing either option, Snowman sat down, which caused the viewers to think he was giving up. Instead, he began to remember the first character he had ever created. 17 years ago, he created a magic caster similar to himself in the present. Back then, he had rushed to that cliff excitedly after discovering the side quest. Since his dream seemed to be continuous, he did his best every day and did not hide his passion. However, he had simply been inexperienced in controlling the character. The cause of death for his caster was a loss of footing while looking for the mushroom. Although it sounded like a ridiculous reason, the tragedy was unavoidable because magic casters were a class that had limited strength and agility, making them unfit for searching for items directly with their bodies. After the caster's accident, Snowman silently wept for making the wrong choice and driving his character to his doom. Despite all the time that had passed, the event left a deep scar that hurt every time he thought about it. There was something to be learned from every experience, and the same was true for the summoner. As the sun set on the horizon, Snowman knew that the time to act had finally come. Suddenly, there was a rumbling sound, and something sprouted from the cliffside. Getting back to his feet, he remembered the extensive research he had done after losing his caster. The corpse finger mushroom was a quest item that was difficult to find because of its unique trait of appearing on the cliff only at twilight. Although it had sprouted at an odd place, Snowman had a way to get it. After a moment of deep concentration, dark purple shadows rose from his body as he activated the Shadow Hand skill, sending 2 dark claw-like hands beyond the edge of the cliff. The Shadow Summoner's basic ability was to create a shadow hand with some physical capability. Although its effect was simple, it was quite useful in such situations. Snowman found it difficult to control the skill because it was his first time using it. While he focused, the viewers recognized his skill immediately. They noticed how difficult it was to control and likened it to controlling a tail that one had suddenly grabbed. They watched as Snowman flailed until he calmed down and planned to finish the job in one go. With great concentration, he finally grabbed the mushroom and pulled it out with one fluid motion. The shadow hands shot high above Snowman, and when he pulled them back to himself, they opened to reveal the loot. The young man inwardly celebrated that his idea had worked. His stunt even surprised the viewers. Suddenly, a bright light shone against the twilight sky and instantly caught the summoner's attention. While looking at the shiny item, he used his perception skill and triggered yet another hidden quest titled The Masterless Pocket Watch. Snowman's new goal was to take the pocket watch with him to Kongori City and find someone who knew about it. With the item hanging from a tree branch, he realized that he would have only returned with the mushroom if the watch hadn't shone brightly. Snowman quickly retrieved the watch and left. Later that evening, the troll sat next to a boiling pot while deep in thought. He wondered whether the human from earlier was trustworthy. The Forgotten One had been despised far more than anyone else in the past, and his mind was filled with the memory of his mother's dying wish. His tragic past was the reason he dared not hope that the disease would disappear one day. Instead of holding on to such meaningless hope, he decided to search for a cure. It was then that he began to read books from the humans that the Rock Canine tribe had hunted. Although it was difficult to read at first because of the language barrier, he was able to learn the alphabet thanks to the incantation tome left behind by his mother. He quickly continued to accumulate knowledge until he finally discovered the cure. At the same time, the troll learned that he did not have much time left. Despite his mission to cure himself before the disease worsened, he still needed a mushroom that he had never seen, that only sprouted on the cliff. His name was Mile, and he wondered whether it was the best choice for him to beg for salvation from the first human he met. Miles snapped back to reality when he heard movement from the nearby bushes. He stood wondering whether the human had returned or if perhaps a member of the troll tribe had come. To his surprise, Snowman appeared and announced his triumphant return while trying to catch his breath. He also seemed to have been infected with the disease, which he admitted hurt a lot more than he expected. When he presented the mushroom, Mile was rendered speechless. Afterward, he regained his composure, kowtowed to Snowman, and tearfully asked for the summoner's name for the first time. A moment later, the human and troll were officially introduced, and the latter revealed that his name meant the Child of the Star. While graciously receiving the mushroom, Mile promised to help Snowman with anything he needed. Right then, a message appeared indicating that Snowman had completed the side quest. After obtaining the cure, Snowman quickly recovered from the rotten branch disease. Additionally, his vitality had permanently increased by 2 points. Mile had also recovered and appeared before Snowman to offer the help he had promised. Considering his main quest, Snowman needed to deal with the Rock Canine tribe. Before him was a list of options that he needed to consider carefully. Since he no longer had access to party members, he chose a method that would allow him to eliminate the trolls from the inside. When Snowman finally made his request, the Forgotten One suddenly had an idea and turned to look at the pot. Later, the summoner arrived at the entrance of the Rock Canine tribe settlement and spotted the 2 guards stationed at the gate. While watching them closely, he recalled Miles' advice that the best time to attack was when the tribe was celebrating the harvest festival. Within the bustling settlement, the trolls eagerly waited for the feast to begin. They made all kinds of preparations to offer a sacrifice to the earth dragon, Tancred. The harvest festival had a rule that none of the trolls could break. At midnight, every member of the tribe was required to drink from the huge pot of boiling animal blood. Mile planned to take advantage of the rule and spike the pot of animal blood with a drug that he had concocted. The pot would then be poisoned, which would be of great help to Snowman's mission. After receiving the potions he would need, the summoner asked whether Mile would be okay traveling alone. In response, the Forsaken One mentioned his mother's dying wish and his willingness to play his part in the disappearance of the Rock Canine tribe. But then, Snowman received an additional quest. The task was to help Mile get revenge, and the goal was to drug the festival's blood pot. Mile destroyed his old hut and watched everything go up in flames before leaving. However, he kept a few items for his journey. The first was the cure to the rotten branch disease, which would be shared with other exiles, and a blank book. When Snowman asked about it, the troll explained that it was his dream to become an archaeologist, and he intended to roam the world and record all his discoveries. At the settlement, Snowman took out the 2 potions he received from Mile. It was finally time to get down to business and complete the quest. The red potion in his hand was the camouflage nostrum, which would give him the appearance of an idiotic troll for a day. It would hide his identity as long as he was not discovered. The blue potion was the madness nostrum, which would inflict those who consumed it with insanity. With the clear descriptions in mind, Snowman chugged down the red potion without hesitation. The rancid smell bothered him a little, but he was distracted when he felt something happening to him. The sensation suddenly overwhelmed him as he coughed and gagged. He soon dropped to the ground as a wave of pain washed over his body. Later, the trolls guarding at the entrance of the settlement noticed some movement from the bushes. Out from them, a bulky frame emerged and walked toward them. Recognizing the figure as one of their own, the guards told him off for being at the wrong place while the festival was about to begin. Snowman's appearance had completely transformed into that of a troll. In response, he awkwardly scratched the back of his head and apologized before the guards told him to enter the settlement quickly. Snowman the Snow Troll obediently rushed in while recalling the effects of the camouflage nostrum. Apart from turning him into a troll for a day, it also granted him the ability to speak the troll language and use the race's unique voodoo skills while transformed. While the Snow Troll was happy to have finally infiltrated the settlement, he carefully scanned his surroundings as he walked. His next objective was to find the pot of blood and lace it with the madness nostrum. Fortunately, he already knew where to find it. From his memories, it was located at the center of the settlement. As the Snow Troll ascended the steps of the mountain, he went over the information about the Rock Canine tribe in his head. The tribe was divided into 5 factions, which only joined forces if something big happened. Otherwise, they remained divided and were constantly at war with each other. For this reason, each of the factions was ruled by a leader from each generation. These leaders were shamans who maintained the connection between the 5 factions. The heirs of the current generation were facing serious issues. They were weaker than previous generations and generally lacking in ability. Because of this, the once powerful tribe was gradually declining, and the snow troll would exploit their weakness to execute his plan effortlessly. Before long, the snow troll arrived at the center of the settlement and found the huge boiling pot of blood. Afterward, he took out the madness nostrum and approached one of the guards. He then respectfully presented the bottle to the guard and explained that it held blood that he wished to contribute to the pot, having obtained recently. Without a second thought, the guard rejected the snow troll's contribution because he thought that the blood within the pot was more than enough. As such, he was no longer willing to listen. The snow troll was not done though, and he quickly explained that the blood he had was special because it came from the white-horned arago. As such, it would be a great contribution. The words instantly convinced the guard, who then took the bottle and agreed to pass it on to the leader. Snow Troll immediately thanked him and was inwardly pleased with his progress. The task was easy because he understood the minds of the trolls. Shortly afterward, the guard presented the bottle to the leader known as Sir Magada, before explaining that one of the trolls wished to offer the blood of the white-horned arago. With the bottle in hand, the leader examined it before popping the cork and taking a whiff. Once he verified that the blood was the real deal, Sir Magada told the guard to add it to the pot. Naturally, the leader was unable to detect the madness nostrum because Mile had masked it well with the scent of blood. This thought made Snow Troll realize that it was not surprising that the Forsaken One had a heroic rank. When the guard emptied the bottle into the pot, the boiling blood turned slightly darker. Afterward, the Snow Troll was notified that the madness nostrum had been successfully used, and those who drank from the pot would be wrapped in madness. At midnight, Sir Magada held up his drinking horn and asked all the trolls to do the same. He then spoke a few words of appreciation to their deity before ordering all the trolls to drink up. In response, all the trolls cheered loudly for Lord Tancred and followed their leader's actions. However, one of them did the opposite of the rest. It wasn't bottoms up for the Snow Troll. Instead, he emptied his horn directly onto the ground. Meanwhile, he observed the leaders gathered for the festival. The 4 other shaman leaders sat in a circle and had yet to drink the blood. While watching them, the Snow Troll was reminded of Miles' warning. There was a reason why the Rock Canine tribe had yet to fall despite their problems, and it was because of one of their leaders. He had single-handedly wiped out the shamans of the previous generation. A troll born with the power of the mountains and the wisest and toughest in all of the tribe's history. This troll was the tribal chief, Jamad. It wasn't long before the pot had been completely emptied of blood. The festival was over and the trolls were departing. Snow Troll watched everyone around him with the knowledge that they all had the madness nostrum in their bellies, and that included the 5 leaders. With them, he expected a slight difference in the effects compared to ordinary trolls. Regardless, the results would be the same after an hour, and that would be enough for the Snow Troll. As long as nothing got in the way, the Rock Canine tribe would disappear by the end of the night. Later that evening, he peeked through the bushes and finally found what he had been looking for: the tribe's treasury. As expected, 2 guards were stationed at the entrance, and both were armed with battle axes. According to his memories, the treasury kept the tribe's most valuable items. Moreover, the guards did not belong to any of the factions. Although they were not as strong as the chieftain, they were still considered powerful. After a while, one of the guards had a strange feeling in his body, and veins bulged all over his face. His eyes gradually reddened before his body tensed up. He then grunted while clutching his chest. The other guard experienced something similar but also began drooling. In an instant, both of their eyes changed as the madness took over. They then turned on each other. However, one of them had taken the initiative and swiftly chopped off the other's head. Before he could do anything else, 2 thin sword lights appeared and severed his head from his shoulders. The attacker was Kaluna, the Moonlight Knight. Snow Troll was right about one thing in that exchange. The trolls would be no match for his summon after being weakened by the madness nostrum, even with the knight's reduced stats. When the Snow Troll asked his summon to follow him into the treasury, they found another guard stationed just outside the vault door. As the intruders approached, the guard turned toward them, revealing a pair of eyes glowing with madness before asking that they identify themselves. The guard's vision was blurred and tinted red. Because of that, he confused Kaluna for the guards from outside. He wanted them to warn the chieftain and the other 5 leaders that something strange was happening. Suddenly, Kaluna charged toward him with a powerful slash. Surprisingly, the guard somehow managed to block it. When Kaluna continued attacking, the troll demanded to know his identity. However, the shadow summon did not reply and continued attacking. Finally, the troll went on the offensive. However, while charging up an attack of his own, Kaluna swiftly stabbed him through the throat. The guard fell to the ground lifeless, while Kaluna towered over his body. For a moment the snow troll remained in a daze because of the knight's power. Afterward, he searched the guard's remains and retrieved an item. It was the rock key, which would allow him access to the vault. When he looked at the vault door, a list of choices appeared. He already knew what was housed within the vault. It was a special item given by the Earth Dragon Tancred to the Rock Canine tribe. The item was created from the Earth Dragon's scales, and was known as the Stone Fist. It was a powerful set of gauntlets that granted the user the power to destroy boulders and immense spell power just by equipping them. However, the gift came at the price of countless battles within the tribe because of their greed. To stop the violence, the shaman leaders were gathered and bound with the curse of brotherhood, despite their lack of blood relation. Snow Troll knew that it was all just a farce because, in reality, the brothers were just a bunch of guys who wanted to destroy each other but were unable to do so. For that reason, Snow Troll decided not to take the Stone Fist and only keep the key to the vault. That would be enough. The tribe's chaos would make the 5 brothers come to check the treasury because none of them could allow the Stone Fist to fall into the hands of the other. Sure enough, the shaman leaders arrived and found the treasury keeper dead. Because the key was also gone, they decided to destroy the vault door, and to their surprise, the Stone Fist was still present. At that moment, one of the leaders, Magata, angrily demanded to know who was responsible for the attack. He went through a round of accusing each of the leaders, before turning to Jamad, who reminded him of how their ancestors had bound them with the curse of brotherhood. Even so, Magata was not content. The last leader argued that it was a bad time for them to play the blame game. More importantly, they needed to restore order to the tribe since they had all confirmed that the Stone Fist was safe. Throughout the settlement, the trolls were busy massacring each other. Finally, Magata agreed to back off, but not before promising to keep an eye on the chieftain. Jamad was warned that he would have to face the wrath of the entire tribe if he acted rashly. Afterward, Magata ordered the remaining trolls to protect the treasury and eliminate anyone who tried to take the Stone Fist. The chieftain was left behind. He was deep in thought as he looked up at the floating gauntlets and seemed to realize something. Elsewhere within the deep caverns of the settlement, Magata was armed with a war axe. He walked past many corpses and cursed because of the mess surrounding him. Eventually, his focus began to weaken. His breath gradually became labored as he struggled to keep the madness at bay. He forcefully suppressed his wild impulses once again, because there was much to do and he could not afford to start tripping. Suddenly, some movement ahead of him caught his attention just as steady footsteps approached him. Magata immediately demanded to know the identity of the stranger. Right then, a message appeared with a warning that the effects of the camouflage nostrum had worn off. That was because the Earth Shaman, Magata, had figured out Snowman's identity. Moreover, the potion had made a permanent change to the summoner. He had completely mastered the level 1 troll language. Snowman was a bit frustrated that he had been caught so soon. Although the shaman before him was considered the weakest out of the 5, he still held the position of a leader. The shadows quickly gathered around Snowman. He was content to have planted a seed of doubt among the 5 leaders with his actions. Magata's eyes shone with madness when he realized that the human before him was the culprit behind all the chaos within the settlement. He was unable to contain his rage any longer, and cursed at Snowman as he charged with a swing of his battle. Snowman, on the other hand, calmly summoned Kaluna from the shadows and ordered the night to destroy the Earth Shaman. As the crescent moon hung low in the night sky, a major battle had ended within the mountain cavern. In the aftermath, the walls had been partly destroyed and deep sword slashes had carved the ground. Magata gasped for air as he lay bloodied on the floor. Despite the madness in his eyes, he felt fear for the first time as he looked at Kaluna. The knight coldly glared at him with his sword held high, ready to deliver the final blow. Unfortunately, Magata could do nothing but curse at Kaluna. Finally, he accepted his fate but swore that his brother would avenge him. With a quick slash from the knight, blood splattered on the ground. Snowman remained expressionless despite the gruesome scene. The Earth Shaman had left a grudge curse on him with his last breath. The curse worked as a debuff, which would reduce his strength and agility by 50% for 1 week. Ordinarily, all the members of a party would share the curse equally, so that their stats would only reduce by a bit. However, the curses would stack up for each of the 5 brothers slain. However, that was the exact reason why Snowman chose Magata as his first target. The Earth Shaman was the weakest of all the troll leaders. Moreover, his class as a shadow summoner was not greatly affected by a decrease in strength or agility. Before leaving, the summoner grabbed a torch from the wall and threw it down, setting everything ablaze. He doubted that the Troll brothers would have the time to avenge Magada's death, because they were bound to get extremely busy from the situation at the settlement. The violence had grown into a full-on civil war as the trolls continued to destroy each other. Eventually, within the chaos, one of the trolls noticed that their leader's quarters were on fire. The roaring flames were a clear sign that something terrible had happened to Magada. The passage within the mountain led to the Rock Canine Tribe's convention room, where the 5 tribe leaders met. Soon, 3 leaders walked through the entrance with rage-filled eyes. One of them shouted, demanding that Jamad show himself. The chieftain, who sat at the end of the room with his back facing the cave entrance, turned his sharp gaze toward the others before acknowledging their presence. Somewhere within the troll settlement was a small wooden hut where the viewers watched a meal being prepared. Snowman decided to do some light cooking, which was a strange thing to do in the middle of a quest. The viewers also wondered why he was suddenly doing such a family-oriented thing. The summoner was almost done and only needed to add one last ingredient: the seed of the moon, which produced unknown effects when consumed. While wrapping up, Snowman considered the 2 types of effects of the seed. One was a permanent stat increase, and the other would give him a temporary skill. If the situation were different, he would have chosen the permanent stat increase. However, that was no longer possible, because he had to prepare for the quest's final battle, where he would need the ability. Cooking was the best way to consume the seed, and Snowman was happy that he could prepare the meal with his memory of the recipe. When he finally took a bite, Snowman could not ignore the bland taste. It wasn't surprising because he couldn't find enough seasoning. Even so, he was just glad to be able to find a quiet place in all the chaos. Before long, he set down an empty dish and received a message informing him that he had received the temporary skill known as the Stage of the Moon. The viewers were naturally curious about the nature of the skill. While Snowman wiped his mouth, one of them discovered that the Stage of the Moon was a wide area of effect skill that buffed any existence within its range that possessed the moon attribute while also debuffing everyone else within the field. While looking out of the window, Snowman knew it was time to take action because the troll leaders had gathered to confront the chieftain. It was time for him to wrap things up. Back in the mountain, Jamad stayed put while his counterparts confronted him. They warned him to choose his words carefully because they were already suspicious of him. Because of that, the leaders wanted Jamad to answer truthfully if he was the one who took advantage of the chaos to get rid of Magada. The chieftain remained silent and thought through the new information. From what the leaders said, he quickly understood the situation. It seemed that an unknown enemy had infiltrated the tribe and was responsible for all the chaos. Jamad also realized that the madness taking over the tribe could have only come from the blood that all the trolls had drunk at the festival, which he suspected had been drugged. He inwardly went over the sequence of events up to the point when the intruder boldly eliminated Magada. It then dawned on him that those actions were not things that any of his weak brothers could pull off. Instead, it seemed like something he would have come up with in one of his schemes. It was no longer surprising why the other troll leaders were suspicious of him. Seeing no other way out, Jamad stood and fastened the straps of his gauntlets. As he walked toward the troll leaders, they could recognize the weapons with one glance. The chieftain had equipped the stone fist. In their madness, the leaders blamed him for everything and accused him of finally revealing his true colors. Considering all the damage the tribe had suffered, they were prepared to get rid of Jamad. When the chieftain accepted all the blame, one of the shamans gathered dark energy in his palm while the others prepared to support him. A mixture of physical and magic attacks was unleashed against Jamad as he stood in place. A moment later, he reacted and took a battle stance. Extending his hand in a claw-like gesture, he thrust it forward, sending a volley of rocks toward his opponents. Jamad's move left the leaders in shock. Unfortunately, it was too late for one of them, who had his entire shoulder blown away. The troll screamed in agony. However, he was put out of his misery before anyone could help. Afterward, Jamad stepped forward to face his next opponent. As he did so, the effects of the grudge curse were felt on his body. He instantly developed lung disease, which greatly reduced his strength. Despite Jamad's anger toward the leaders, he admitted that he understood why they would suspect him of scheming against the tribe. However, he accused them of coveting his position within the tribe. As he spoke, the stone fist gauntlets pulsed with energy. Finally, his eyes glowed with madness as he was no longer able to resist it. The rocks on the ground began to levitate in response to the gauntlet's power. However, the next opponent did not retreat. Instead, the leader attacked, while warning that Jamad could not rely on the stone fist because its power was too overwhelming for any single user. Before his opponent's attack landed, Jamad covered himself with rock armor and spoke to the Mother of Earth, Tancred. Meanwhile, his opponent's attacks were unable to leave a scratch as they struck his rock armor and bounced off. Jamad closed the distance and tackled his opponent in an instant. He then eliminated the troll with his brute strength. The latest victim of the one-sided massacre was named Trogo. Finally, only one shaman remained. While the last troll despaired, another grudge curse hit the chieftain and significantly weakened him once more. The stone fist gauntlets dripped with blood as Jamad struggled to catch his breath. The final opponent lay lifeless with a gaping hole in his torso. After the last fight, Jamad received yet another grudge curse, which gave him heart disease for a week. The latest debuff would prevent him from regenerating his vitality during that period. Jamad thought of his dead counterparts as nothing more than a nuisance. As the only leader left within the tribe, he planned to unite all the surviving trolls. His thoughts were interrupted when he detected movement at the entrance. While turning in that direction, he hurled a large rock before asking the intruders to identify themselves. The intruder was the Moonlight Knight, who destroyed the incoming rock with one swing of his sword. While Jamad was still stunned by Kaluna's strength, Snowman appeared with a smirk. The summoner was quick to tell off the troll chieftain for fighting his brothers instead of maintaining a good relationship with them. At that moment, Jamad realized that the human standing before him was responsible for the destruction of his tribe. The next battle was about to begin, and Kaluna started walking toward Jamad with purpose. The Moonlight Sword was clenched tightly, ready to cut down the enemy, and the knight's power surged as the ambient moonlight strengthened him. At that moment, Jamad knew a fight was unavoidable and charged up his gauntlets. He referred to Snowman as a devil before asking whether he had come to claim the tribe's mountain. Instead of responding, Snowman casually looked to the side as though the matter had nothing to do with him. In anger, Jamad charged. Both fighters released powerful auras as they closed the distance. When they finally clashed, a huge blast shook the entire cave. Jamad had struck out with a punch while Kaluna blocked it with his sword. Afterward, the troll swung his hand and hurled a barrage of rocks toward his opponent. Kaluna was swift with his slashes, cutting down all the projectiles. The clash revealed something to Snowman. The fighters were evenly matched. Although Jamad, with his stone fist, ought to have been exhausted from his previous fights, the summoner speculated that with the current pace of the fight his summon would not struggle much. While Jamad continually blocked the sword strikes, he taunted Kaluna and Snowman for their weak attempt at destroying the tribe. When the knight blocked another of his punches, the summoner was worried for the first time. The two opponents continued to trade blows. However, one of them constantly attacked while the other was forced to defend. Jamad had the upper hand, and gradually overwhelmed Kaluna. Snowman inwardly cursed while wondering if he would be able to confront the troll with his reduced stats. Snowman watched as the fighters charged in for another clash. He was confused because he assumed that the troll had been weakened by the multiple grudge curses left behind by his brothers. After Kaluna blocked another heavy blow, Jamad claimed that he possessed the power of the very mountain itself. The knight desperately blocked the troll's follow-up attacks while the latter was consumed by rage and boasted about having the entire world under his feet. The last blow sent Kaluna tumbling back. However, the knight stayed on his feet and guarded his master. Snowman realized that there was only one way to reverse the situation. Although difficult, all he needed was the correct timing. Jamad did not slow down and raised his fists while activating his earthquake skill. When he slammed his fists into the ground, the rocks were shattered and sent flying toward his opponents by the impact. Although Kaluna tried his best to destroy the rocks, his opponent was not yet done. While the knight was caught up defending the human, Jamad leaped into the air as if performing a finishing move. Despite the troll's injuries, he threw a punch with all his might. At the last moment, Kaluna blocked with the flat of his blade, bending it a little from the force. After witnessing the troll's power, Snowman knew that something was off. Although the stone fist gauntlets had incredible attack power, they also had a rebound effect that hurt the user. Because of that, Jamad should have been wrecked by the recoil. While the summoner racked his brain, the troll chieftain prepared to attack once more and claimed that his body was overflowing with power. His blood was flowing into the gauntlets, whose aura resembled a flame. Instead of weakening Jamad, the stone fist granted him even more power. When he raised his clawed hands to attack, Kaluna defended in the nick of time. The blows seemed to be getting heavier when Snowman realized that the troll had found a way to recharge the gauntlets. The only mystery was how Jamad was still able to use his magic power. For this, only one possibility came to mind. The stone fist gauntlets had somehow evolved into the mountain fist gauntlets. Snowman remembered the item's description after transformation. However, no other information was included. The summoner was frustrated by his current situation. He had no idea what was happening because he had used the same quest strategy for many years. Because of that, he should have been able to control all the variables. The quest scenarios would change slightly depending on which of the troll leaders was chieftain. While Kaluna continued to defend, Snowman realized that Jamad's very existence was the wild card. The summoner noticed the danger Kaluna was in but was unable to warn him in time. Jamad had used a powerful blow that sent Kaluna crashing into his master. When the dust settled, Kaluna was seen on his knees while Snowman froze in place, too injured to move. Finally, he let go of his staff and collapsed. He started passing out as he watched Jamad charging in for another attack. At that moment, he had a flashback. When he first played the game many years ago as a child, the masked deities advised him to run away from a fight. Back then, his legend had yet to mature fully. During that quest, he was the party leader, and the pieces had been accidentally put in danger. A red-masked deity suggested that they sacrifice some of their pieces and count their losses. However, Snowman shot down the suggestion because they had all worked so hard to make it that far. When the deity argued that new pieces could always be created, Snowman explained that he had been misunderstood. He acknowledged that the pieces they controlled had worked so hard to get to the point before asking how everyone could abandon them so easily. The rest of the deities sighed as they thought Snowman was acting recklessly to save a few pieces. Although they didn't agree, they still let him do as he pleased, and asked if he could pull it off. Snowman knew that the pieces that ran instead of fighting were always the first to be destroyed. However, he tried to find a solution that involved neither fighting nor escaping. The reason why his pieces always produced miracles was that Snowman always chose to confront the crisis. In the present, a staff slammed into the ground. Snowman used it for support as he ignored the pain and slowly rose to his feet. When looking up, he saw that Kaluna's body had been greatly damaged. Jamad yelled as he prepared to unleash a massive attack. The landslide. While getting up, Snowman wondered how long he had been out for. When he noticed that Kaluna's moonlight power had fully charged, he knew that the moment he had been waiting for had arrived. Finally, the troll charged with a shout while Kaluna took a stance. At that moment, Snowman's staff shone brightly. His expression turned fierce as he activated his newly acquired skill. When the stage of the moon was activated, a brilliant circle with complex patterns spread around the night while a great wave of earth surged toward him. Jamad, on the other hand, was surfing on his attack. As Kaluna prepared to attack, he had a sudden spike in power. The overflowing moonlight surprised the troll as he entered the range of Snowman's field. The knight's stats had increased by 50%, while his opponent's strength reduced by 20%. Kaluna broke his stance and ran with a tight grip on his sword. Out of habit, he also told his opponent to be humble. While Jamad's confidence started shattering, Snowman kept up his skill and boldly declared that his knight would never lose. Finally, Kaluna made a downward slash, and dense moonlight energy flowed in its wake. With his strength at its peak, Kaluna performed his finishing move, the Moonlight Slash. Jamad screamed as the brilliant sword energy clashed with his landslide skill. Although Snowman was caught in the blast, he braced himself for the impact. When the dust and debris cleared, a scene of destruction was revealed. The cave had collapsed, and the ceiling was replaced by a clear view of the sky at dawn. Jamad lay defeated, gasping for air. His eyes also dimmed with each passing moment. The power of his gauntlets had also greatly weakened. As the troll chieftain looked up, he referred to Snowman as a demon. However, he quickly corrected himself and addressed the man as a shadow summoner. He knew that he was on his last legs and used his remaining strength to beg the summoner to take him. Despite Jamad's unwillingness to die, Kaluna quickly delivered the final blow, ending the troll's life. At that moment, Snowman received yet another grudge curse, which reduced his stats by a further 30% while also giving him skin disease. Fortunately, the last of the 5 troll brothers had died, and all their grudge curses were lifted. Snowman's breath steamed in the cold morning air as the viewers were stunned by what he had just pulled off. It was time for the summoner to check out his rewards. He had gained new titles and achievements, and took a moment to go through each of them and learn about their special effects. Not only did he gain experience and increase stats, but Kaluna also gained the same and awakened a new ability. Although the viewers were surprised that a shadow summon could strengthen alongside its master, they were more impressed with how skilled Snowman actually was. As the young man looked at the remains of the slain chieftain, he considered turning the troll into one of his summons. He knew that monsters usually hated becoming summons because they could not rest in peace, and most were unwilling to serve the same master that had ended them. Jamad was different because he was not only willing to become a summon but had requested the same. The troll chieftain was a wild card. And with him added to the team, the unexpected was bound to happen, Snowman thought. Afterward, he stretched out his hand, feeling like he had no choice, and activated his shadow summoning skill. It would be a shame to miss out on such a powerful monster. He watched as the dark energy surrounded the troll chieftain and began clearing after a moment. Jamad's restored body emerged from the shadows and stood before his new master. Having been resurrected as a shadow summon, the troll vowed to become Snowman's loyal servant. Before the summoner could say anything, Jamad suddenly requested to be allowed to do something. As expected, Snowman had no idea what the troll was talking about, but had an idea when he saw Jamad gathering the remains of the dead leaders. The chieftain laid them on the ground close to each other and sat cross-legged. Afterward, he stretched out his hand and activated the shamanic absorption skill. He drained the remaining energy from the bodies and added the power to his own. With their power, Jamad promised the leaders that they would remain together, even in death. The sun rose quickly over the destroyed troll settlement, and the survivors, whose madness had worn off, scattered in fear when they learned that all their leaders were dead. Meanwhile, Snowman was notified of his achievements and the effect they would have in the world of eternity. His reputation quickly spread throughout the lands, and even the merchants sang praises for his achievement. Snowman managed to single-handedly free Kongori City from the threat of the Rock Canine tribe, and every citizen knew his name. This was not surprising to Snowman because he understood that the player's actions would affect the course of events within the game. That was one of the mechanics of the world of eternity that ensured that things would remain interesting. Finally, he had one task to do, and that was to open his reward chest. Within was the Rock Canine tribe's holy object. When the chest was opened, Snowman received 2 instant level-ups, increased stat points, the Mountain Fist gauntlets, and the stone robe. He was surprised to discover that the tribe's holy object was actually Jamad's gauntlets. The viewers went into a frenzy when they saw the rewards. Some even thought that they were absurd. Because the troll used the gauntlets, Snowman equipped them to Jamad. Afterward, he looked at the stone robe. The piece of gear not only gave him additional stats but also increased his vitality by 10%. The robe also possessed the special trait of never getting dirty. The summoner's new look made the viewers excited, and some thought he finally looked like a pro. Eventually, Snowman checked out his last reward. It was the Root of Spirits, a consumable item with unknown effects. Because of this, he decided to save it for later when he had the chance to prepare it. A slight smile appeared on his face as a familiar light surrounded his body. A moment later, Snowman was teleported away.